and this trajectory at the UN. Ms. Mostafavi?
Sorry.
Sorry, surprise again.
I know, I'm being surprised left and right today. Sorry, you guys, I have to come and give the lecture from here because much like the keynote address, I wasn't quite aware of the way that the conference is being managed. But I think that what I like to do in this section, and I may go through some of the slides quite fast, is one, to make it more interactive as a dialogue, and so we can have your inputs. So I hope that by being on this side, it doesn't sort of come across as we're just giving lectures, so we can also get your feedback. But the other part of it is to really give you a sense of the way that we have tackled human security at the UN. You might all know it, and therefore I apologize if all of this is a bit redundant, but I thought it was important that you will have a good sense of both methodologically as well as, you know, some of the political sort of trajectory that has happened with regards to human security. Some of this has already been said in the opening remarks, so I'm not going to talk about it, except that to say that to a large extent, the interest in human security came about because of the fact that we recognize through the work that the United Nations does, in particular in situations where the fragility is quite high and the challenges are multidimensional, that we couldn't really deal with the various insecurities in an isolated manner. And that we had to really look at this renewed consensus on the totality of the human condition. And when you look at human individuals, I think one of the things that becomes very important, and you ask people, for example, what is your sense of your security, which to a lot of people, if you also translate security, while many think it's security oftentimes with police, but if you go a little bit further, and depending on the conditions that they have, you will find that for many people, it is these three, and then what they have become the three pillars of the UN. So I think it's no surprise that the Charter of the UN was established based on these three pillars, which is peace and security, development, and human rights. So for a lot of people, when you talk to them, they really do speak about the sort of total aspirations they have. Oftentimes it has to do with poverty, it has to do with safety, and it has to do with dignity. That sort of corresponds with what we do with regards to human security. So, and this was very much in the 1994 Human Development Report, that when you look at different kinds of threats, be it conflicts, natural disasters, or abject poverty due to exclusion, these kinds of threats have manifestations on these different domains of human security, which in the 1994 Human Development Report, it was identified as economic insecurity, food insecurity, health insecurity, environmental, personal, community, political, and then of course as we go forward, it could be other insecurities, but these were what was identified. But what is very important here is to look at a threat situation, and then especially as academics, but also as practitioners, to bring it down and to say, okay, now what does this mean with regards to people's everyday lives? And with regards to, again, that sort of sense of security that they hope to have. And then you can see that, okay, it has manifestations on different areas, and that's where these areas then become identified. So again, here it's just sort of taking this one example of violent conflicts and how seeing that it sort of has these ripple effects. So when you have violent conflicts, oftentimes it leads to deprivation and poverty, which then in turn can lead to resource depletion, spread of infectious diseases, education deficits, social tensions, criminalities, and further conflicts. So now also, if you're trying to deal with conflict prevention, or if you're in an environment of a post-conflict peace building, unless you don't address the totality of the challenges that people are facing, what you're ultimately doing is that you're going to have deficits in some areas. And therefore, again, that sort of total whole condition of security, you do not return it back to the people and the communities in which they live in. Now, for us, in a sort of most basic level, when we speak of human security at the United Nations, and in particular the unit which we are the focal entity within the UN on human security, we very much break it down into these three freedoms. These three freedoms also correspond with the three pillars of the United Nations, as I explained to you. So it's freedom from fear, freedom from want, and freedom to live in dignity. And I think you know what these sort of correspond to. And ultimately is also, again, this whole notion of the fact that look at the individual is in the triangle, you need these three pillars, but at the same time, when you strengthen development and you strengthen human security and you strengthen peace and safety, it sort of has this virtuous cycle. And that's also the whole thing that, in the UN jargon, we had come about and said, there is no peace without development, there is no development without peace, neither of which are without human rights. So again, it's this recognition of the importance of the interlinkages of these three different pillars and their mutually reinforcing relationship. Now, if you look at it comprehensively, so one of the things that was that happened in the UN was many people said, and this is from 1994 and quite a lot many years later, they said, well, human security, of course, it's a lovely idea, everybody agrees with it, but it's so broad. I mean, how do you apply it? It's just completely impossible to actually apply this approach, sort of in addressing things on the ground. And so our task was, and we were able to benefit from the projects that we have. So many of the principles that we have developed is truly based on the projects and therefore the application of human security that we saw these principles can actually further sort of give the analytical vigor that you would need in order to do a human security analysis and therefore response. For us, it is very much a protection and empowerment framework that is based on 4 principles. It is people-centered, comprehensive, context-specific, and prevention-focused. And why we have this sort of kind of aspects is that, one, we see that in any society you both need the protective, so these are the institutions that need to be there. The state is one of them, but you also need other institutions, be it public and private. And then you also need the empowerment, which is the voices of the people, but also the actions of the people in this relationship. So what we call a top-down, bottom-up. And in this top-down and bottom-up, and you need to have them both. So it makes no sense to have a very strong protective, say, environment, but then have your communities and not necessarily engaged in the process of this, building of human security. Because ultimately, then what that happens, say, for example, is that when you have, hypothetically, a natural disasters, communities are very weak. Then unless the top-down does not respond, the community has no way of knowing what they're supposed to do with regards to their own response and their own resilience building. So that's why you sort of emphasize the importance of this top-down, bottom-up, and also because in some countries, you simply don't have the resources to have everything be down from a top-down. But on many other aspects, it just doesn't make sense to have just one side or the other side for that matter. And then the people-centered is the fact that, again, we're looking at individuals, and as I explained, when you look at individuals, it becomes quite clear to us that these 3 freedoms are indivisible. So you cannot say one is more important than the other. They are all equally important. Comprehensive is, again, the totality of the people's conditions, and it is when you look at, again, the example that I gave you, this then leads you to the fact that you have to have multi-sectoral responses. Again, if you want to have impact. If you really want to have impact, it's better for you and for a community to have all of their various insecurities addressed. Again, of course, there's going to be prioritization, but at the same time, there has to be, when you do the analysis, a clear understanding of what the challenges are, what the insecurities are, what would be the comprehensive approach, and what would be the short, medium, and long-term, based also to some extent on the capacities that are available there. Context-specific is this notion that you don't have a one-size-fits-all, but that you actually look at the realities on the ground. And I think this point is extremely important when you're looking at what was mentioned by the Ambassador of Japan, which is that you now have inequalities and you have poverty, which is quite, which is increasing and is at a very large number within middle-income countries. And so one of the things, and this is also what we are trying to stress with regards to the post-2015, but also other factors, is that you cannot have policies also directed from, say, the capital for different regions, particularly if you live in a society where, due to geography, due to ethnicity, due to all kinds of factors, different regions are different in their sort of structure, in their composition. And therefore, you have to understand the context of these various things. And so macro indicators don't really show you the kind of meso and micro variations that you have. And that's the kind of importance of human security. It brings you down to look at the reality on the ground of what people are facing, but also what their composition is. What is their need? What is their vulnerabilities? But also what are their capacities? So what do they have? What is this environment that you're trying to address? And then prevention focused is pretty much not just fixing things, but also trying to look at the root causes and trying to, address sustainable solutions. And here you have the early warning, comprehensive capacity building, etc. And if I'm going beyond my 10 minutes, let me know, yes? And I'll, So I won't go into, because I think I don't have much. I mean, I have more that I want to say. So, the added value of these things is that, again, as I explained, when you look at the people-centered, it provides a much more disaggregated analysis. It therefore is able to reveal to you the situations of individuals and communities below the sort of national level statistics. It gives you also a more nuanced of the regions, of the social groups, and the different types of threats and vulnerabilities are within different regions, etc. Context-specific, it again allows you to have a much deeper understanding of the local context, including the root causes of the insecurities, and their progression over time. So that's another thing. Comprehensive, it's again tries to bring together a much more integrated, not necessarily separate component, demarcated, but a much more one whole of package, or as what we say, whole of problem solutions. And I think, again, the reason for that is because of the fact that in many of the societies that human insecurities are also highest, the vulnerabilities are multiple, and therefore the response has to be also a much more integrative and comprehensive response. And then prevention-oriented is simply that the added value that it does bring is that it starts to give you early warning before a crisis turns into, or a challenge turns into a crisis. And usually it is much easier to try to prevent something than to try to fix it once it's happened. So that's also another aspect. Now, within the UN, we have different pathways in which we have advanced human security. One of it is through our unit. We support the General Assembly processes, so that's the SG reports, the GA resolution, the consultations, the GA thematic debates, which you will see that, for example, the thematic areas where human security has been included are the post-2015, migration and development, protection of children in arms and conflict, climate change, natural disasters, and other things. So we do try to also input into these discussions of member states. We support the Trust Fund. And the Trust Fund has, as the ambassador said, 450 million that so far we've given to 219 projects. And one of the very, very added value of this Trust Fund has been that we have looked at human insecurities across regions. Therefore, we have dealt with different themes. We have not necessarily, as a result, have prioritized what human security is more important than the other, because again, human insecurities differ from one region and one country. And through the Trust Fund, we've also been able to, in a way, further refine the approach that we have, correct the approach that we have, and try to sort of learn from the lessons that these projects have given us. And then, of course, we collaborate also with UN entities, but in addition to the UN entities and member states, also with academics and NGOs. And I'm very happy that most recently the Global Partnership for the Prevention of Armed Conflict put together this very, very comprehensive assessment of human security based on 6 countries that they covered. So there's also a lot of activity that's being done at the NGO level on human security. And at the academic level, as you know, this is the 20-year anniversary conference. There was a conference also in Oxford Brookes. There have been other conferences in other places with regards to human security. And so there is a great amount of interest with regards to human security in the academic environment, especially publications, journals, and so on and so forth. And particularly human security and natural disasters, human security post-conflict peace building, human security and persistent abject poverty and exclusion, those kinds of areas. Well, that's the Trust Fund. I would say that just to give you some examples of some of the projects that we have done through this Trust Fund, and so again, for us, the application of human security, one of it is the sort of nexus between climate change, poverty, human insecurities, and in some cases, in this case, not in Lesotho, but in some cases also competition over dwindling resources and how that could also result in tension. But also other things, like for example in Kenya, where we have the climate change nexus with poverty, migration, tensions, is you will have migration, for example, from pastoralist communities into urban centers. Now, this is a challenge for both the pastoralist communities who lose people that leave their communities and therefore their own ability to be able to sustain themselves. But you also have people that are coming from the pastoralist communities that oftentimes do not have the education, do not have the know-how of how they're going to actually survive in the thing. And then another one is in the Balkans here. Here we've been very much focusing on the the importance of making sure that there is the social, political, economic, cultural, and legal systems together. We are trying very hard in the various projects that we do, both have integrative responses because the challenges in some regions are quite multiple, but also try to enhance inter-ethnic tensions, try to enhance the fact that, as was recently called in one of the projects, strength in diversity. So that's another thing that we're trying to do. And lastly is going to be with regards to South America, and there we are dealing with citizen security, particularly the relationship between police, crime, and how, again, you have to deal with it in a very comprehensive way, look at the root causes, but also look at the communities as being very close partners in also the whole relationship between police and community. So that's another thing that we try to do. And I'm not going to say anything more because I have to go.